Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful day. The night Diep was swept away by the flood, James didn't just feel scared. He felt emptied out. Rain still hammered the roofs when he stumbled back into the village with Ly clinging to him. Mud coated his legs. His hands shook so badly, he kept readjusting his grip, terrified she'd slip. And his throat felt shredded. He'd been yelling Diep's name for so long that every shout came out rough and broken, like the storm had stolen his voice, the way it stole people. He moved like a man trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He'd sprint down a narrow lane, stop dead, swing his head as if he'd heard something, then realize it was just wind cracking through palm leaves. The village lights were blurred by rain. Everything smelled like wet earth, dirty water, and fear. Ly kept asking over and over in the smallest trembling voice, "Where's Mom? Where's Mom?" At first, James tried to answer. He tried to sound solid. "We're going to find her. She's strong. She's Diep." But the words didn't even convince him, because every time he looked toward the canal, he saw black water twisting past, and in his head he kept replaying that last image. Her hand above the surface, then gone. Still, he didn't stop. He couldn't. If he stopped moving, he'd have to accept what might be true. So he ran. He ran with Ly through the rain, splashing through puddles, slipping on mud, calling out, "Diep! Diep!" until his voice turned into a hoarse rasp. He knocked on doors. He pulled neighbors outside with flashlights and bamboo poles. People joined in quiet urgency, scanning the ditch line, calling her name into the storm. No one needed explanations. Everyone here knew what floodwater can do. By the time the rain finally eased near dawn, James still hadn't slept. He sat on a neighbor's porch with Ly wrapped in a blanket, both of them damp underneath, staring into the gray before sunrise. His eyes were red. His hands kept clenching on his knees. Every few minutes he'd stand up, like he remembered something, then freeze again, listening. Morning didn't bring relief. It brought reality. The water had lowered, but it was still dangerous. Fast in the canal, thick and cold in the paddies. Debris clung to the banks. Torn leaves, branches, scraps of cloth. The fields looked like broken mirrors under a cloudy sky. And the village moved as one. People showed up without being asked. They spread out along the canal bank, walking carefully, eyes scanning the reeds and bends where the current loved to trap things. Nobody talked loudly. Nobody joked. It was that kind of search, the kind where everyone is afraid of the answer, but not searching would be its own cruelty. James walked at the front, even though his legs felt numb and heavy. Ly stayed with a neighbor for safety, but she kept trying to run after him, crying that she wanted to find her mom too. Every time James heard her voice, it felt like a nail in his chest. They checked the tight curves of the canal, the thick grass, the places where water pooled dark and still. Someone prodded floating branches with a pole. Someone else lifted mats of reeds. James kept whisper calling her name because his voice was almost gone. "Diep, Diep, can you hear me?" Nothing. Minutes stretched. The light grew brighter and more unforgiving. James's mind started doing that horrible thing, trying to prepare him for pain by imagining the worst. He fought it. He told himself, "She's alive. She's stuck. She's waiting." Then a shout cracked through the silence. "Over here!" It came from farther down, near a dense patch of reeds where the canal bent and narrowed. Heads turned, feet splashed. The group tightened into a rush. James didn't even remember deciding to run. He just ran. He shoved through tall grass, slipped once, caught himself, heart slamming. Another voice yelled, louder now. "Here! Someone's here!" James burst through the reeds and saw it. A bamboo thicket half collapsed into the canal edge, and tangled in that mess, as if the water had thrown her there and the bamboo refused to let go, was Diep. For a split second, his brain refused to accept it. She looked unreal, soaked, muddy, limp. Her clothes were torn. Her hair was caught in branches. Her skin was pale with a bruised purplish tint around her lips and fingers, like the cold had tried to pull her away. But then he saw her chest move, shallowly, barely, and everything snapped into focus. "She's breathing," someone said, voice shaking. James dropped to his knees in the mud. His hands trembled as he reached for her, afraid to pull wrong, afraid that if he touched her, she'd vanish. Two villagers carefully separated the bamboo, lifting it back with poles, freeing her arm and shoulder. Diep's eyelids fluttered. Her mouth opened like she wanted to speak, but didn't have the strength. "Diep, I'm here," James whispered, leaning close. "I'm here. Stay with me." Her eyes opened a fraction, unfocused at first, then slowly finding him. There was no drama in her expression, just exhaustion so deep. It was frightening. Her lips moved, and the sound that came out was barely a breath. "I'm still here," she whispered. "Don't be afraid." James's face crumpled. He gathered her into his arms as carefully as he could, like he was holding his whole life. Mud, water, terror, love, all in one fragile, shaking bundle. He kept repeating, "You're here. You're here," like saying it would make it real. And then Ly appeared, breaking free from the neighbor's hand. The moment she saw Diep, she collapsed into sobs and threw herself into the mud to hug her. "Mom!" she cried. "Mom! You promised you wouldn't disappear again." Diep tried to lift a trembling hand and touch Nyi's cheek, tears mixing with rainwater on her face. "I'm sorry, baby, I'm sorry," she murmured, apologizing right there in the mud. James didn't say much. He couldn't. Instead, he bowed his head toward Diep. One slow, heavy motion that felt like a thank you, an apology, and a vow all at once. They laid a jacket under her and lifted her carefully, making a quick stretcher with two bamboo poles and a woven mat. Diep drifted in and out, shivering, her teeth faintly chattering. Every time her eyes closed, James panicked and leaned in, calling her name, checking her breath like he didn't trust the world to keep her. Ly wouldn't let go. She walked beside them, one muddy hand holding Diep's fingers, the other gripping James's sleeve like she was anchoring both parents. The villagers cleared a path, stepping aside in silence. You could see it on their faces, relief mixed with shock, like they couldn't believe the flood had returned her. By the time they reached the first houses, the sky was brighter, but James's eyes were still red. He kept his head lowered as he walked, rainwater dripping from his hair, holding on to the one thing he'd thought he'd lost. Diep was alive, and for the first time since the flood took her, James could breathe. They brought Diep straight to the nearest neighbor's house because it was close, warm, and, most importantly, safe. No one even debated it. In villages like this, you don't wait for permission when someone's life is hanging by a thread. The door was already open before they reached it, and a couple of aunties rushed out with blankets like they'd been expecting them. "Quick, bring her in," someone called. Inside, the air was thick with warmth and smoke from the fireplace. The contrast hit James immediately. Outside was cold rain and muddy water, and in here it was dry heat, crackling wood, and the smell of boiled ginger. They laid Diep down near the fire, propping her up carefully with folded blankets. Her whole body was trembling uncontrollably, not from fear now, but from the cold that had sunk deep into her. Her lips were still slightly purple. Her hands were stiff. An older woman knelt beside her and started rubbing her arms briskly. Another poured warm water into a cup, steam rising, and held it near Diep's mouth. "Slowly," the woman instructed gently. "Just little sips." Diep's eyes fluttered open again. She tried to sit up but didn't have the strength, so James immediately leaned in, sliding an arm behind her shoulders to support her. "Easy," he murmured. His voice was still rough from shouting all night. Diep's gaze met his. weak, glassy, but present. She swallowed, then managed a tiny nod. The cup touched her lips. She sipped, coughed once, then sipped again. The warmth seemed to wake her up in small pieces, like her body was returning, bit by bit. Ly didn't move from her side. The moment they'd brought Diep in, Ly had climbed onto the mat near her mom, knees in the mud, hair still wet, eyes still swollen from crying. She kept one hand locked around Diep's fingers, as if letting go would tempt the world to take her again. "Mom," Ly whispered, voice thin. "Don't scare me like that." Diep's face tightened with guilt. She tried to lift her hand, but her arm shook. James helped her, guiding her hand up to Ly's cheek. Diep's palm was cold, but the touch was gentle. "I'm sorry," Diep said again, barely audible. "I didn't mean to." Ly's eyes filled instantly. "You promised," she cried. And this time, it wasn't just fear. It was anger too, the kind children feel when love turns into terror. "You promised you wouldn't disappear." Diep's throat worked as if she was trying to swallow her own sob. She pulled Ly closer as much as she could and murmured into her hair, I'm here now. I promise I'll try my best." James watched them, and something in him cracked quietly. He'd been holding himself upright with pure force all night, not crying, not breaking, just moving, searching, fighting. But now that he could see Diep breathing in a warm room, now that he could hear Ly's voice shift from panic to exhausted tears, his body finally let go. His eyes burned. He turned his face slightly away, blinking hard, jaw clenched. He didn't want anyone to see how close he was to falling apart. One of the villagers, a man with mud up to his knees and a flashlight still in his hand, rested a hand on James's shoulder. "She's tough," he said softly. "Lucky, very lucky." James didn't answer with words. He only nodded once, slow and heavy, because lucky felt too small for what they'd survived. Another auntie brought a towel and draped it over Ly's shoulders. "Come on, little one," she coaxed. "Warm up. Your mom needs you strong." Ly wiped her nose with her sleeve and nodded, but she didn't leave Diep's side. Not even an inch. Diep continued sipping warm water, and gradually, her shivering eased from violent shakes into smaller tremors. Her breathing steadied. Her eyes stayed open longer. Every now and then she'd glance at James like she was checking if he was real too. James stayed near, one knee on the floor, one hand resting lightly on the mat beside her, ready to catch her if she slipped away again. After a while, the neighbor's wife brought a small bowl. Thin porridge, a little ginger, a bit of salt. "Just a few spoonfuls," she said. "It will help." Diep managed 2 spoonfuls before her stomach protested and she shook her head. James didn't push. He'd learned something in the last 24 hours. Survival isn't a straight line. Sometimes the body needs time to accept it's safe. The room quieted. Outside, the rain had softened into a distant drizzle. You could still hear water moving in the background, but it wasn't roaring anymore. It sounded tired, like it had spent itself. Inside, the fire crackled steadily, the kind of sound that calms the nervous system without you realizing. The villagers gradually stepped back, whispering to each other, taking turns checking on Diep, but giving the family a little space now that the crisis wasn't immediate. Ly, finally, started to fade. Her eyelids drooped mid-sentence, her head tilted onto Diep's arm. She fought it for a few minutes because she didn't want to miss anything, didn't want to look away and have her mom vanish again, but exhaustion won. Diep shifted carefully, wincing as her muscles protested, and pulled Ly into her lap as best she could. James helped, arranging blankets around them like a nest. Ly fell asleep with her face pressed into Diep's chest, one hand still clutching Diep's shirt. Diep stared down at her daughter, tears quietly sliding down her cheeks. She didn't make a sound. She just kept stroking Nye's hair. Slow, repetitive, like she was reassuring both of them. James sat a short distance away, near the edge of the firelight, watching. His eyes were red, not just from lack of sleep, not just from rain, from everything. He watched the rise and fall of Nye's breathing. He watched Diep's trembling fingers smoothing Nye's hair. He watched Diep's face, so exhausted, so pale, but alive. And for the first time since the storm began, he felt something loosen inside his chest. Not relief exactly. More like a peace. The kind that arrives only after horror, when your body finally realizes it doesn't have to sprint anymore. Diep looked up at him and held his gaze. There was no big speech, no dramatic confession. Just a quiet understanding, passing between them. James lowered his head again, not the same bow as earlier by the canal, but softer now. A thank you, a recognition, a silent promise to never take this moment for granted. Diep's lips moved, voice barely there. "Thank you," she whispered. James swallowed hard and leaned closer, careful not to wake Nye. His voice came out low and shaky. "Don't do that again," he said, not as anger, but as fear. I can't." Diep nodded, eyes shining. "I know," she whispered back. "I know." And then there was nothing left to say. The scene settles into stillness. The fire glowing, the rain fading, the village outside slowly returning to its rhythms. Diep sat with warm water in her hands, Nye sleeping peacefully in her arms, and James watching them both with red, exhausted eyes, like a man who had walked through the worst night of his life and somehow found his way back. For the first time after a long chain of horrors, they had something they hadn't had in a long time: true peace. After Diep is swept away by the flood, James is left nearly numb with shock. He runs through the rain with Nye, shouting Diep's name until his voice turns hoarse, refusing to stop even as fear takes over. By morning, the water begins to recede, and the entire village joins the search, spreading along the canal banks in tense silence, dreading what they might find. Just as James reaches his breaking point, someone spots Diep tangled in a bamboo thicket near the reeds, exhausted, bruised and freezing but still breathing. James collapses beside her and holds her like he's holding his whole life. Diep whispers, "I'm still here. Don't be afraid," while Nye sobs and clings to her mother, begging her not to disappear again. Later, by a neighbor's fireplace, warmth returns, and so does hope.